In this edition of the Talking Toughness podcast series, we welcome Paul Taylor, a former British Royal Navy aircraft officer. Paul is an exercise physiologist, nutritionist, and neuroscientist who is currently completing a PhD in applied psychology, where he's developing and testing resilience strategies with the Australian Defence Science Technology Group and the University of Newcastle. Paul is the founder and director of the Mind, Body, Brain Performance Institute, where he delivers resilience, leadership, and executive performance programs for an impressive array of global organizations. His latest venture is the Resilient Mind, an online program and app that is currently used by a number of corporations and has proven benefits for resilience and mental well-being of participants. Now, in 2022, shortly, he releases his book called Death by Comfort, when he argues that modern life is killing us, and usefully, he offers some solutions. Paul, in fact, runs his own podcast series where we've been guests, so today we turn the tables on him. Welcome, Paul.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I actually sound reasonably impressive in that introduction.
Well, you've got some bits and pieces.
It's all smoke and mirrors.
Yeah, there's
all smoke and mirrors.
Firstly, let's go straight to death by comfort. So,
nice way to go.
Premise there?
I think that's my ambition.
Death by comfort. Yeah, it's a very snappy title. What's the core premise, and why do you think that's the case?
So, look, the core premise on it is that our genome hasn't changed in over 45,000 years. And we have a genome that is essentially wired for being a hunter-gatherer. But we have taken that genome and we've plunked it in this modern world where we are not moving anywhere near as much as we should do and actually need to for proper functioning, where our diet has changed to the extent that more than half of the calories that we consume are ultra processed foods, which are really targeting our brain's reward systems, and we end up doing a lot of comfort eating. We also are digitally connected but socially disconnected. And importantly, we are robbing ourselves of these really conserved biological mechanisms that actually make us resilient. And what I mean by conserved biological mechanisms is that you see them across species and across timelines. You see there's a number of different species, from all the way from fruit flies to worms to rodents to primates to humans, that benefit really, really strongly from exposure to stressors such as exercise, cold stress, and heat stress. And our modern comfortable environments, we just don't move very much, and we live in thermoneutral environments, and it's robbing us of this stuff that actually drives resilience at a biology level. So a lot of psychologists talk about the psychology of it. And yes, I'm interested in it, but I always say it's necessary, but it's not sufficient. It needs to interface with the biology as well.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point, that, because, like I say, when we talk about stress, we often think about it purely from a kind of psychological point of view that ignores that huge area of biopsychology. And it's really interesting, because I suppose then those kind of physical stresses that we would encounter are replaced by there's still stress, but it's a different kind of stress, right? Yeah. So when you're managing workloads or a feeling that you need to achieve X, Y, and Z, that would be quite different to sort of what the fireflies and the rodents and the hunter-gatherers are managing, right?
Absolutely. And I think I talk about that quite a lot in my book and in my presentations, is that now we have lots of novel stressors, and if you're listening to this, the alarm going off in the morning is a stressor, right? It's a stress to your cardiovascular system. And if you press snooze, you're getting multiple shocks to your cardiovascular system. But then, we've got to get kids out to school in the morning. We've got to get a fight amongst the traffic, although there's probably not much traffic where you are, John, but lots of us have lots of traffic. Yes, indeed. And then, you've got workplace stress. There's change, workplace change that causes stress. And there's all of these insidious psychological stressors that in and of themselves aren't huge, but it's the cumulative load, right? It's that switching on at low to moderate levels of what are supposed to be emergency systems. So our fight or flight response and our HPA axis. And I always say to people that the human brain is pretty amazing, right? So we could have a pretty deep philosophical conversation about God and religion and science and all of that. And that's really heavy stuff that requires a big brain. We could also have a conversation about metacognition, the fact that you can think about the fact that you can think about stuff, right? And if you're a listener, just think about that for a second. But this amazing brain of ours has a double-edged sword in that primates are the only species, and particularly humans, whose thoughts can activate the stress response system. And that means that we can sit and ruminate about some bullshit that happened 20 years ago or the news that we've just read, and we can create a stress response as if we're being chased by a lion. And we can also catastrophize about something that might happen in the future and often never does, but you'll create that same stress response. All of this is being done almost in absence of hormetic stressors that I mentioned earlier on, which are, so just to cap this off, hormesis is basically sublethal exposure to stressors or toxins, which at high levels can kill you, but at low to moderate levels induce stress resistance. Things like exercise, inoculation, cold, heat. Yeah. And also lots of phytochemicals in food are hormetic polyphenols that we're not eating very much of, and we've replaced them with McDonald's and KFC and crap like that.
Is this an observation about Western society? Because as we travel around the world, we don't see all of these things in every society we come across.
No, I absolutely, Doug, and I should have prefaced it with that. And it's not all of those things happen in all Western societies. If we take the food thing, the worst offenders are the Americans, the Canadians, the Brits, the Kiwis, and the Australians. We eat the way more ultra processed food than the French or the Spanish. But I think globally, if we look at exercise, globally, it tends to be a bit of an issue. There was a big study done, 111 different countries using smartphone data around physical activity patterns. And no country, on average, got about 7,000 steps a day. The highest was Hong Kong and China at 7,000. The lowest was Indonesia, actually, at 3,500. And if you've ever been in Indonesia and seen the roads in Indonesia, you understand why they don't walk very much. But, Americans, Brits, Australians are all very similar, about 5,000 steps a day. Now, there are other societies such as the Scandinavians who do engage in particularly the heat and the cold stuff. And certainly other societies where they move more and eat a better diet. But we're even seeing in those developing nations that this comfort food is just fast developing, and it's increasing at a rapid rate of knots. And I believe the combination of those things is driving not just our physical ill health, but our mental ill health as well.
Okay. Why do you think people then in Western society are defaulting to processed foods? Is it easier to prepare, easier to get?
It is a bit of that, and it's also a huge amount of what's called the bliss point. So basically, these foods hijack our brain's reward systems and make us want to eat more. So they're called, this term called Moorish, that I used to think was a made up term, but it actually does exist. So we know the bliss point is certain combinations of fat and sugar, or fat and salt, or sugar and salt, or ideally all three, fat, salt, and sugar. Now, those three, they are the neurobiology of preference. So our brain our hunter-gatherer brain has a natural bent for fat because it's energy dense, for sugar because it's a ready source of available energy, and salt or sodium is necessary for life. And food scientists know this. And so they actually do experiments on the bliss point that actually activates these reward centers in the brain. When you eat it, it tastes amazing, and it releases dopamine, and dopamine says, that felt good. Do it again. Have another Pringle, John. And then they add in all these flavors and emulsifiers, an emulsifier is something that makes it feel amazing in your mouth. Just think of cheesecake, right? So they're adding in all of this stuff that is just hijacking our natural reward systems in the brain.
Yeah, you got me craving a nice sort of salted caramel chocolate, Was you saying that humans would be unique amongst the primates in terms of the metacognition driving physiological stress? And
yes, I believe that we are. Now it's pretty hard to do those experiments on primates because you can't really ask them, right? But the thinking is that our neocortex is more developed and richer. And that we particularly have that ability for metacognition. I'm not sure whether it has been evidenced in other primates or not.
Yeah, my kind of very rudimentary understanding knows about the difference between the evolution of the prefrontal cortex, of course, that primates don't have, and whether that's a source of great metacognition and misery and bad choices. I'm not so sure. But I do find that really interesting. So then, because we're kind of dealing with these cognitive stressors, I've got a to-do list, I've got a deadline, and it's all created, of course. None of these are natural stresses. So then having that kind of day-to-day managing bills and work and family and stuff like that, how does that then have an increase on the, I suppose we use the term allostatic load, like that? That physiological increase. Could you just talk us through that a little?
Yeah, absolutely, and it's a great point, John. So there's two. So for the listeners, for the benefit of the listeners, I know you know this, but there's two parts to our stress response system. So we have our fight or flight mechanism, fight, flight, or freeze, and that is very, very fast acting. Goes through the nervous system, and the adrenal glands end up producing adrenaline and noradrenaline, and as our American cousins like to call it, epinephrine and norepinephrine. And so that is very, very rapid acting, and actually is nature's natural way of dealing with stress. But if the stress is prolonged or very, very intense, then the HPA axis kicks in. So hypothalamus, pituitary, and adrenal cortex this time. So it's the adrenal glands at the same time, but it's the adrenal cortex this time that produces major stress hormones, glucocorticoids, the major one being cortisol. Now, cortisol, when it's released, in the short term, it's actually a good thing, because if someone was just to burst into your room right now with a gun or attack you or whatever, or the lion chasing our hunter-gatherer ancestor, cortisol's released, and it actually makes your senses keener and sharper. It makes your pupils dilate to take in more information. It dulls your sensitivity to pain in case you get attacked, and it helps to mobilize blood sugar, dumps blood sugar into your system. So in a short term, to deal with an intense stressor, that's really, really useful. But over the long term, cortisol makes you fat, it makes you sick, and it destroys your brain cells. So we know that it particularly can destroy dopamine and serotonin and norepinephrine producing brain cells. And so you end up with low levels of these things, which then contribute to mental health disorders. And basically, it's a process that we call excitotoxicity in the frontal lobes, where they're basically getting excited, stimulated to death, and there's too much glutamate and it can basically kill them. And then when a brain cell dies, it spills out a whole heap of other glutamate that then becomes toxic in the brain. And you get this really nasty knock-on effect in the brain. And we're seeing that people who have chronic stress and high allostatic load, that tends to go hand in hand with an enlarged amygdala. And that's pretty amazing, particularly some of the modern studies looking at people who are chronically stressed over time. So, we could follow the three of us and a bunch of listeners, put us in brain scanners every year, ask about the amount of stress in our lives. And you'd see over time, the people who are reporting significant, consistent stress, their amygdala grows bigger and more sensitive. They become hypervigilant, and their frontal lobes actually shrink. And that then means, this is really critical, that you have a brain that is less able to regulate your emotions, because part of the frontal lobes basically are the handbrake for the amygdala. So the amygdala is the part of the brain that largely it's to do with strong emotions, but particularly with threat, fear, and negative emotions.
Yeah, and so I think where that kind of connects so well with the mental toughness side of things, resilience, hardiness, and I understand how you then start moving into applied psych, right? Because
yeah, absolutely.
If we see that as the impact of chronic stress and not appropriately managing chronic stress, then the next logical thing is to say, okay, so I don't want my cortisol levels going up and up and up and leading to reduced dopamine and serotonin and more glutamate in the brain and all that kind of stuff. So what do I do about it? How do I manage those chronic stresses?
Absolutely. And look, this is, if we had the answer to that for everybody, we'd all be multimillionaires. But so for me, it's always I like to take an integrated approach, a mind, body, brain approach to this. Right. So, when you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? So physiologists would tell you it's all about exercise. Nutritionists would tell you it's all about nutrition. Sleep scientists would tell you it's all about sleep. And psychologists would tell you it's all about your mind. But we know that all of those things interact with everything else, right? I think that Western science, since the time of René Descartes and this whole idea of dualism, Western science started to develop this very much Newtonian Cartesian world view, which, as you know, John, having done your PhD, this sort of stuff serves us very well when we're trying to break things down to its smallest component part and understand them. And so science tends to be very siloed, and practitioners are often very siloed, but it misses the fact that we are a ridiculously complex ecosystem. And I often talk about how exercise is not just about how you look, but it helps you to manage stress. It also helps you to sleep as well. And it actually grows volume in your right prefrontal cortex, particularly, which is the seat of willpower in the brain. We also know that if you have a poor night's sleep, your stress hormones are higher the next day. Ghrelin, your hunger hormone, is higher the next day. Leptin is lower, and it has a powerful impact on voluntary physical activity. So you're much more likely to sit around on your arse all day long. You're much less likely to work out. Then you're less able to handle the stresses of the day's events, and you're more likely to end up soothing your anxiety of an evening with a few drinks or crap food. And in both cases, it impacts upon your sleep. And then I could go on and talk about the nutrition but one other thing, when we to just talk about the psychology here and some of the stuff I loved about reading your guys' book and some of the light bulbs going off was particularly around that that challenge aspects of it, and the control aspects. That whole how you view things psychologically. And I had often talked about that. There's beautiful research showing that if you view something as a threat or a stressor, so this is a potential stress, if you view it as threatening or stressful, it activates your HPA axis and cortisol. Whereas if you view it as a challenge, it actually activates your fight or flight mechanism, which is nature's more effective way of dealing with that stress. And so the biology, the physiology, and the psychology do this beautiful dance that can either be a beautiful dance or a horrible wrestling match.
There was it's, I think, fascinating, and I think you're so right in terms of the dualism aspect there, Paul, where it is that if you're a hammer, so with dualism we tend to, because most people might only have an expertise in one area, so you tend to look at that. So I suppose that's your unique element. But what you say about the sensing a threat there, I remember a former PhD student of mine, Mark Thompson, works at London Met now. He did a study during his PhD, right, where he had people doing a 16.1k time trial on a stationary bike, and they were given different feedback throughout different points. So they were told if they were in the top whatever, they won stuff, and there was a punishment for those at the bottom. And then they were given feedback halfway through as to where they were, and we measured their cortisol response. And
it was amazing. This already.
I tell you, it was an incredible response, given that they were given one line in something that they weren't particularly passionate about. They're only taking part in a study in a lab in a university. And the threat group were told basically, so if you're in the bottom two, you get a punishment. And they were told something like fifth from bottom or something like that. So essentially they're given this, if you don't pick it up, you're going to finish in the bottom. So they're given a threat state. Whereas those who were told you're fifth from the top, and of course we were just lying, it was all like we do because we're psychologists.
Yes.
So they saw it as an opportunity to, if I improve, I can win something, rather than I can steer clear of something. And their cortisol went in opposite directions.
Interesting.
What was also interesting, the ones who were told you're currently in the top two, their cortisol was more similar to the threat group, because they were doing well, but it was a sense of, I've got something that I need to hold on to here.
Yeah.
And I tell you what really struck me about that is, this is not something that people were really invested in. This is not something they've worked years for. This is just a random study. And they were given one line of feedback, literally like 5 words. And that's the impact. And I thought, imagine then if that stressor, that threat, is not just one line of feedback to something that's unimportant, but it's constant and it's daily and it's about something that actually matters. You think, geez, what would the impact be over a long period of time there? I don't think we'd get ethics to do it for years.
No, definitely.
That's why they use rats.
Yes, indeed. But it is fascinating how our psychology affects our biology and how our biology affects our psychology. And the way I always position it is that the brain/mind is the master controller of the body. Right? It controls everything that goes on in your body, or most things that go on in your body. But it is completely dependent on the health of the body for its functioning. And if the body is not in great health, the brain is not going to be in great health either, and is not going to function well.
Yeah, you go to that well and say, I need this to be able to manage, and it's empty.
Correct.
You're going to have a hard time.
You're kind of taking me to the edge of my comfort zone in terms of knowledge. I come from a different background. I actually, first of all, studied biochemistry, but switched to economics. And my interest was, why do people behave the way they do when there are so-called economic systems that should work? And the economists tell us, if you do something to the system at one point, you should get a result at another. But it doesn't work like that. People mess those systems up.
Yeah, and interesting, particularly when you come to human behavior. Economics plays a huge role in human behavior. So, and particularly something called temporal discounting, or hyperbolic discounting. So what we know is that our brains are more attracted to threats and rewards that are clear and present. So they're immediate, they're within our grasp, and they discount threats and rewards that are off in the future. And this plays out on an absolute daily basis when it comes to our health. So most people, when you ask them, would they like to be healthy? They say, yes, they'd like to be healthy. They'd like to exercise that day. They'd like to eat well, maybe have an alcohol-free day. And then you walk past the cake shop, right? And that visual sight of those cakes. And for me, cheesecake is the one that does it. But if you've had a prior experience with cheesecake, as soon as you clock that cheesecake, dopamine is released in your brain. Now, a lot of people say dopamine is about pleasure. That's not 100% correct. It's involved in pleasure, but it's more about goal-directed behavior and motivation. So it actually goes, cheesecake, we like cheesecake, go and get the cheesecake, right? And at the same time, I'm thinking, no, but I'm trying to be healthy. And your brain is actually going, yeah, but you could be dead tomorrow. So go and get the cheesecake. So this is why health behavior change is particularly difficult if you're thinking about, I want to be healthy in the future. I don't want to have chronic disease, because that's really far off and your brain will discount the value of that. And then you're faced with all of these everyday temptations that actually trigger dopamine and goal-directed behavior in our brain. So behavioral economics, I'm fascinated by it when it comes to human behavior.
Well, I was doing my degree in economics, and we did a little project with in a department store in Wolverhampton. It was the big department store, and they had a haberdashery department. You don't have those anymore because people don't make their own clothes, which is another topic. But they used to sell fabric, and this store was having trouble shifting this fabric, and it was slightly more expensive than most of the stuff they had, but for some reason it just wasn't shifting. So they gave it to us as a project. They said, right, can you work out why this stuff isn't shifting and then develop a strategy to shift it? And we'd been learning about, raise price, you drop volume, and so all of that sort of stuff. And what we decided to do is we put this fabric right in the middle of the department, and we hiked the price. We doubled the price. It shifted in days. The whole lot just went. And, for me, that was a wake-up moment. And that's what's got me on this journey. They can, start to come across people like Peter Clough and other psychologists trying to understand what was going on. And, I just thought, we know what's right. We know what's rational. We know what is the right thing to do. We don't do it. And we don't do it so often. It's almost a normal pattern of behavior.
Well, the economist, I'm pretty sure he's an economist, Dan Arley, has written a great book called Predictably Irrational. How human beings are predictably irrational in so many different ways. And that's all to do with the psychology of things.
I wonder, Paul, I was really interested in what you were saying about that kind of goal-directed behavior is essentially what's linked to reward. Can we therefore manipulate the goal-directed behavior? And I'm thinking of exercise here. I know I played a lot of sport growing up, so I'd been very fit, and then throughout my adult life, you let it go, and then you get it back, and whenever you think, right, I'm going to get myself fit again, if you've been fit before, you've always got the advantage that it'll come, so you keep going through that really hard bit. Exercise is not much fun when you're not very fit. Yes. But actually you start to get a bit of a buzz from it. When you go through that first wind on a jog, that happens after a couple of minutes when you start out. But if you keep going for a few weeks, and it's quite enjoyable. When that happens, are you shifting that goal-directed behavior? You're getting rewards for things that were previously not rewarded.
Yeah. So there's a number of things that play into this, right? And so when we're talking about behavior change, I like to. I mean, this is where reading your guys the Developing Mental Toughness book. There was so many
available in all good bookshops.
Yes, that's the one. I was just nodding my head vigorously at so many points in reading that. So let's talk about the goal orientation, the achievement orientation, right? So we know that if you want to do successful health behavior change, setting goals is hugely important. But I like to dig a bit deeper. And most people have heard of SMART goals, right? It's got to be specific. It's got to be measurable. It's got to be achievable. It's got to be relevant to me. It's got to be time-based. But I like to get a little bit finer on that. And so for a lot of people, and there'll be people who are listening to this who think, yeah, I want to lose weight. I want to get fit. I want to do this. I want to do that. So I always say to them, so write down your goal, whatever it is. And if your goal is more than 3 months away, I want you to write it down on a piece of paper and put it away in a drawer. And you write a goal, a 3-month goal, that will get you towards that big goal. And then I like to say to people, take that 3-month goal and break it down into monthly goals. And then take your monthly goal and break it down into weekly goals. And the reason I talk about this is I used to be a helicopter navigator. And so we'd navigate, we had GPS, but we had backups. You do dead reckoning and do that all throughout training. And you would, if you wanted to get to A to B, you wouldn't just draw a line on the map and just go. You'd have lots of waypoints, as we call them, along the way where you could then check in to see if you're on track or you're off track. And if you're on track, that gives you a good feeling. And if you're off track, you then adjusted to bring yourself back on track, right? So I like to use the natural psychology that we all have about, I'll start Monday, right? I'll start next month. I'll start in spring, summer, right? So we are connected psychologically to weeks, months, seasons, years. So, and I like to take it down into weeks and say, right, so you're going to take that monthly goal and you're going to bring it into weeks. And then you're going to set a process. But every Sunday, the people I work with, they say, just score yourself on how you did that week. Sometimes it'll be a 7, 8, a 9, or 10 out of 10. And you go, that's awesome. What did I do on Monday? What did I do on Tuesday that set me up for a really good week? Sometimes it's a crappy week. It's a 2 or a 3. The wheels come off. And often that's when people throw in the towel. But this is where you just go, you know what? That wasn't great, but I need to just reset tomorrow and I need to make sure that I beat it next week, right? So that achievement orientation, I want to do whatever it takes. But I like to then go process beats goals every day of the week, right? So what are the behaviors that I need to do? And I have this concept of a ritual board, which is a board. And my initial one was my half of the bathroom mirror when at 40 years old, I decided to become a professional boxer. But I had all the things that I needed to do written on that mirror, and I had weekly targets. And so I had some big ones, go and see my old school boxing trainer who used to torture me, go for a run, do some visualization. But I had a whole heap of body weight exercises, right? Things called frogs, which are a little bit like squats, kick sets, stuff like that. And I put weekly targets. I started off with 100, then 200, because I realized that every time I did like 20 or 30, and I'd go and I'd write it on my bathroom mirror, I was getting more motivated. And that was when I had my epiphany about motivation. Motivation follows action, not the other way around. There's too many people who are sitting waiting for the motivation fairy. So many adults still believe in fairies, and the motivation fairy doesn't exist. What we now know from neuroscience, when you are in forwards motion, when you are taking steps towards your goal, however small, the brain releases dopamine, right? And they've done these amazing studies. Anna Huberman talks about this on rats. And when two rats, you put them in this sort of tube and they have to face each other and one backs off. And if one backs off, it's much more likely to lose the next fight, and then lose the next fight and lose the next fight. And the winner is much more likely to win. But if they just take the rat and they push it forward, it actually has a much greater chance of winning. And they find that dopamine is increased in the brain, right? So we know that natural rewards for the brain: food, water, sex, nurturing, and achievement, right? And they all release dopamine that says, that felt good, do it again, right? So this is where I like to have people, they set their goals, and part of your that whole goal orientation, achievement orientation, I like to give them a tool of breaking that goal down into little parts, breaking it down into the week, and then it's all about the process. And you take track of the process, and you have that, whether it's your bathroom mirror or whether it's on a little board that's on your kitchen, where you see it lots, because every time you see it, it's a trigger to do the behavior, right? So I'm a big fan of visual triggers. So right behind my desk, I have kettlebells and club bells. And whenever I see them, they're a trigger for me to get off my ass and do 30 seconds or a minute of exercise, right? Mm-hmm. So for behavior to happen, this is BJ Fogg's stuff, who's just a guru of behavior change. You need a trigger, you need some level of motivation, and you need the ability to do that. So when you're highly motivated, you do the hard stuff. When you've got low levels of motivation, just do something. And I think that's really critical, because if you just do something every day, you're in forwards motion. And that is going to keep that dopamine going that says, yeah, that's great. And then when you're evaluating, hey, I'm actually starting to make progress, tangible progress towards my goal, because I've broken it down into small chunks, that builds self-efficacy, the belief that what I'm doing is making a difference, which, John, you'll know as a sports psychologist, is hugely, hugely important.
I think there's so much gold in what you're saying there, Paul. The process stuff is absolutely important, because ultimately that's how you put it into action. In sport, I'm always telling people, look, every sports performer has these sort of performance indicators. Like, but how do you actually get there? What I really like, I'm a huge fan of breaking down this fallacy that there's this linear sort of motivation to action. And I think it's because we inherently think of motivation as this future-oriented construct. Mm-hmm. It's throwing something forward to, here's what I'm going to do in the future. And that's one of the things that, again, it's great for optimists, and goals, the traditional SMART goals work well for optimists. But do you know what? What if you're naturally a bit more pessimistic? That future goal of where you're not is a measure of how shit you currently are. It's not a measure of where you want to get. It's not motivating. Yeah. Actually, for some people, and this is where we added the learning orientation to the challenge part, that actually motivation stems sometimes from looking backwards. And I think if you are naturally just more comfortable looking backwards, and some people are just more past oriented than others, then seeing how far you've come is far more motivational. And I think that really speaks to that point of action can happen first. There's no need to say I need the motivation to do it, because if you're the kind of person that's thinking that, you you're pretty much setting a narrative that's allowing yourself to not do it anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. And I 100% agree with you that looking back can be really useful. And I loved reading that in your book about that learning orientation. And I think I said on my podcast that in our karate dojo, which I workshopped with all the kids, one of the things that's written on the wall is you win or you learn, right? And that culture really was bestowed on me from the aircrew world in the military, because they are very, very, very good at learning, not from just their own mistakes, but from other people's mistakes. Because when you fly in helicopters, and particularly in naval helicopters, where you often operate very far from the ship, you don't have the luxury of learning from your own mistakes,
No.
right? And so in the aircrew world, if you are the aircraft captain, so we would have shareholders every morning, right, where there would be a brief. There'd be the HODs, the heads of department would give their brief. There'd be the flying order of the day and what was happening. The engineers would give a brief. And then there was always a brief about safety incidents, that any safety incident that was relevant to us was actually read out. And the aircraft captain was not allowed to sign out their aircraft unless they had read safety incidents that came from other aircraft, because this culture really started that we need to learn from everybody else's mistakes. So in the military, and I often bring this into the corporate world, lots of corporates, you go to conferences and there's all people talking about best practice, and they have these guys who did this great sale or did this great bit of business standing up and talking about it. And I'm always like, where's the screw ups? Who's standing up talking about their screw ups? Because that's really, really valuable for people to learn from, here's what we did, here's what went wrong, here's how we screwed up, so that other people can actually learn from their mistakes. So I'm a big fan of learning, not just from your own mistakes, but learning from others' mistakes. And there needs to be that culture of embracing failure in order to do that, to communicate it so that not only you can benefit, but that others can benefit as well.
I completely agree with you. When we're doing presentations on the mental toughness concept, I often describe learning orientation as the beating heart of the concept. Because when you think about, where did we get our mental toughness from? Well, some of it is genetic and some of it is learnt. Well, if some of it's learnt, learning orientation is an important bit of our mental toughness. I'm just going to take you back for a minute to goal orientation, because again, we completely agree that process is important in delivering goals. But one of the things I've noticed in the last couple of years, and we perhaps don't make enough of it in the book, is the importance of purpose. Because it's dead easy to set smart goals. And then the killer question is, why are those your smart goals? And I would say 50% of the time, I don't get a reasonable answer. It's because they're mesmerized by the process. I can set a goal and it gets me off a hook because I now have done something that I should, but I don't know why I'm doing it.
Yeah. And
I think there's a link to motivation there.
Yeah. Oh, look, for sure. So I've got a model that I teach around behavior change. It's called the easier model of behavior change, right? And the E stands for explore your reasons why.
Yeah,
that's the first bit, right? Us research, we love a good acronym. The A is accountability partners. The S is scaffolding your goals. The I is around imagery. The other E is around creating the right environment, and the R is around rituals and ritual boards, right? But the explore your reason why, that's hugely important. I mean, Anthony Robbins, who most people have heard of, find your why, you'll find your way. What he doesn't say is he nicked it from Friedrich Nietzsche, the German philosopher who over 100 years ago said, he who has a why to live can bear almost any how, right? And self-determination theory by Professor Richard Ryan and Ed Deci. I'm a huge fan of self-determination theory. I don't know if you guys are familiar with it. I'm sure you are as a sports psychologist. But so they talk about there's a motivational continuum. So for the listeners, there are some who will be amotivated. That means they have no motivation. Most people move from amotivation into what they define as other determined extrinsic motivation. That includes things like somebody dangles a reward at you to do something. We're very good at doing this with our kids, right? Or you dangle a reward at yourself. If I get fit, I'm going to buy myself this. If I lose weight, I'm going to buy myself that. Or so other things that come into this are guilt. You feel guilty about the shape you're in. You feel guilty about your drinking, your smoking, your drug taking, whatever. Or coercion. Somebody saying, John, you need to exercise more, or you need to sort out your diet. Doctors are really good at this. If you don't change, you're going to die, right? And so they are very powerful motivators. And I'm sure everybody listening will go, yep, I have started on a change journey from one of those motivations. What Deci and Ryan have shown, and they've studied tens of thousands of people across 30 years, is that most people who stay in that phase of motivation ultimately fail. These are your yo-yo dieters. They lose weight, they put it back on. You know, people, they stop smoking, they start again. They stop drinking, they start again. They get fit, they get unfit. The people who succeed, the vast majority of them, cross what they refer to as the threshold of autonomy, where they find their own reasons why it's important for them, not for anybody else. And often this is an emotional reason, right? It's an emotional pull, because emotions drive so much stuff in the brain. Anybody tells you emotions have got no place in work has got no clue how the brain actually works, right? But I'll tell you a little story if I can that exemplifies this beautifully. So it was a number of years ago, I did a workshop for a large life insurer over here, and it was around behavior change. And I said, look, is there anybody in the audience who really wants to change a behavior and they're struggling and they're happy to do some role play? And this lady put her hand up and she said, yes, I would like to do it. And I said, okay, so what's your goal? And she says, I want to stop smoking. I said, okay, why is that important to you? And she said, because it's not good for my health. So I dug and I dug and I dug and I dug. And all of a sudden she burst into tears. And she said, my two little boys, who are 8 and 6, came into my room last night. She's a single mom, in floods of tears. She said, because the 8-year-old had seen an advert on TV for smoking that said that smoking causes lung cancer. And they had a few months previously been to her mother's funeral, their grandmother, who died of lung cancer. And it was talked about. And the 8-year-old had obviously stored it away. And he just made the connection. And he told his little brother that mom's going to die. So they both came into her room in floods of tears saying, Mummy, we don't want you to die. And I went, bingo, there's your why. You need to find a way to remember your why every day, because smoking is so hard to give up. Chemically, it's really, really addicted. So, you know, your motivation will wax and wane. And at those low points, you need to remember your why. You know what she did? She tattooed her foot. And she sent it to me. I've got a picture of it that I present in presentations, and it says, remember your why. It's this nice little flower around it. And she has the initials of her little boys. And she said she would stand in the shower every morning. And I'd said to her one thing. I said, you know, with something like smoking, you need to take it a day at a time. So I said, JFT, just for today. Get up in the morning, look at yourself in the mirror and say, just for today. Now she tweaked it. She stood in the shower in the morning. She looked at her foot. She looked at her tattoo, and she said, just for today, I'm not going to smoke. And she said she made a pact with herself that she was allowed to smoke if she looked at her foot first, right? So she kept cigarettes on her. And she said she started wearing open top shoes to work, right? This is brilliant. And she said On at least 100 occasions, she went to smoke, and then she remembered she had to look at her food, and she just looked at her food. She went, you know what? It's not worth it.
Mm.
So having that strong why, that purpose behind what you're doing is hugely, hugely important. So I will talk about purpose a lot, and I also talk about values. Values and purpose for me can be used interchangeably. So for me, I mean, I'm Irish, I'm ex-military. Jesus, I like a tipple as much as everybody else. But the thing that keeps a handle on my alcohol consumption and also keeps me exercising regularly when I don't feel like it is I have a very, very, I've got this a very strong value of being authentic. So as a corporate speaker who stands up and talks to people about dealing with stress and resilience and well-being and motivation, all of this stuff, I have to walk the talk. I have to be authentic. And it's when I have those weak moments that's my go-to value, is around being authentic. So I talk to people about a mixture of purpose and values and connecting your behavior either to the purpose or to values that are important to you.
Yeah, that's really good. And anyone who's interested in self-determination theory as well, I think the website actually gives you all the 6 different sub-theories and cognitive evaluation and things like that essentially help you understand how to internalize that motivation. Because as you say, Paul, there's tons of research to show if your motivation is purely extrinsic, it's a matter of time before it falls down. So the goal then is to a lot of things start that way. It's being able to find that mechanism for internalizing them, and I think that's probably where it ties in with the sort of the commitment and the goal orientation and what you want to achieve as well.
Absolutely, and a really good point there, John, is that it can play a role. That extrinsic motivation, things like rewards, can absolutely play a role, but you've got to, in tandem with those extrinsic motivators, develop internal motivation as you go. And to your point earlier on around the exercise, is that what we find is that lots of people don't like exercise, right? And they really don't enjoy it. It makes them feel uncomfortable. And I always say to people, right, why are you exercising? And often the answer is because I want to lose weight, or I don't want to get disease, or my dad had a heart attack. And I go, too far away, right? Temporal discounting. That shit ain't gonna work, right? Not for the long period. And I encourage them to think about how it makes them feel, right? Yeah. How do I feel after I've exercised? And it works the same way. You're looking at a Krispy Kreme donut and going, oh, I shouldn't eat that because I don't want to break my diet or blah, blah, blah. It's like, no. How do you feel afterwards, right? Is try to tap into that feeling. But when people do regularly exercise, we see lots of them actually start to enjoy it. And there's really good experiments on this, that they'll take a bunch of people who are not fit, they'll split them in half, they'll give them to exercise physiologists, half of them, the exercise physiologist is pushing them, or the personal trainer, whoever it is pushing them. And they'll puff and they'll get their butt. If you just let people self-select their intensity and give them encouragement, they will get there eventually, right? And they are more likely to enjoy it at the end of it, right? So that intrinsic motivation will come. And I think we can add stuff onto that. We can really enhance that with some of that stuff around achievement and goal orientation, where you're setting yourself little goals and measuring it. And hey, you know what? I'm starting to get faster, right? That's what I say to people when you're exercising. Time trials. You've got to measure yourself, because your brain needs feedback that what you're doing is making a difference. And the beauty is, right, if Mr. and Mrs. Nurkenfurken, who are 50 years old and overweight and haven't exercised in years, I always say the beauty is your window of adaptation is huge. And what I mean by that is that they can do almost any exercise and they will get fitter quick. Whereas people who are fit and exercise a lot, their window of adaptation is really small. For them to get a 1% improvement, they need to do a huge amount of work, right? And actually, when you look at the research, the biggest bang for your buck in terms of health is going from the lowest category of cardiorespiratory fitness to below average. Yeah. Like that is a huge impact on your health. And I think that's a huge motivation that we can be telling people is that you can, if you do nothing, I say to people, this is wonderful because anything you do is really going to move the needle, right? But you got to measure stuff and you got to give that feedback because then you know you're in forward motion and that's going to double down on your motivation.
Paul, we've got a major challenge. I've no idea. This is our second conversation. And I think we haven't quite worked out how to do a 13-minute podcast. And I think these are some of the most enjoyable conversations, well, I've certainly been party to. Fantastic. And that's what I particularly like. We usually talk about 2-3 takeaways, but there's just one here. And that's how from the first minute, you have broadened the subject of stress and brought in all these other perspectives so that you can see the joins, you can see how they're all connected. It takes a lot of grasping, but I think you've done a fantastic job in this podcast doing that, Paul.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Doug. I thoroughly enjoyed the conversation on my podcast when I had you gents on, and I've thoroughly enjoyed this conversation, and I certainly look forward to a bit of collaboration in the future because the stuff you guys are doing on mental toughness it's awesome and it's very, very timely.
Yeah, and you've just made my day today because when you spoke about the average number of steps taken by somebody in the West is about 5,000 steps a day, I'm averaging 11,500 at the moment.
Brilliant. So brilliant. I love it.
I'm going to go out for a walk right now.
Thank you, gentlemen. Enjoy your day in dreary old Blighty in Ireland.